Good afternoon and welcome to Lunch with League. My name is Martha Buttsier. I am co-president of the League of Women Voters of San Jose and Santa Clara. We also serve the cities of Milpitas, Morgan Hill, and Gilroy. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. Our purpose is to encourage informed and active participation in government and to influence public policy through education and advocacy. We do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. Each month we meet for Lunch with League. We host a speaker who can share information and ideas that will help broaden our understanding of issues in our community and our nation. This month, we welcome New York Times bestselling author Eleanor Herman. Eleanor has written several books of popular history, including Off with Her Head, 3,000 Years of Demonizing Women in Power, which is the subject of today's presentation. She has hosted Lost Worlds for the History Channel, The Madness of Henry VIII for the National Geographic Channel, and America, Fact and Fiction for the American Heroes Channel. Eleanor says she likes to study the past to better understand the chaos of the present. And there certainly is plenty of chaos in 2023. Following Eleanor's presentation, League member Barbara Marshman will pose questions sent in advance, as well as those you sent through chat as they occur to you today. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Eleanor Herman.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the intro, and I am delighted to be here. This is an extremely important conversation for all of us in this country and around the world, and I hope you enjoy my presentation. I am now going to attempt to share my screen. And there we go. My journey into this subject began one spring day in 2019 when I sat down to read a book on the amazing life of a controversial, smart, powerful woman. And settling into the story, I was disturbed to see a calculated, misogynistic hate campaign to take her down. She's unlikable, she's untrustworthy, she's sexually depraved, she's disgustingly ambitious, she's a spendthrift, she busts men's balls. Now, you might be thinking I was reading about Hillary Clinton. In fact, I was reading Stacy Schiff's 2010 biography of Cleopatra. And I noticed that in Cleopatra's rise and fall, the story of her power and Rome's horror that a woman should wield it, there were uncanny similarities with Hillary Clinton's trajectory through the 2016 election and beyond. Now, certainly we can judge some of the political choices of both Cleopatra and Clinton negatively, but what I found was much more than that. In each woman's story, I discovered organized smear operations, churning out unfounded accusations of sexual improprieties and criticisms of her ambition, untrustworthiness, appearance, and unlikability. Accusations rarely made about male leaders, either in the 1st century BC or today. Wait a minute, I said to myself as my jaw dropped. Has this same stuff been going on for more than 2,000 years? Longer than that, I found, when I delved into female pharaohs who lived many centuries before Cleopatra. More than 3,000 years. So in between Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who came to power in 1478 BC, and Kamala Harris, countless other powerful women have been subjected to almost identical sexist takedowns. Now, these accusations rarely have anything to do with experience, political mistakes, policy, or platform. They are name-calling caricatures that create two-dimensional comic book villainesses. She's a whore, a lesbian, a nymphomaniac, frigid, or all of the above. She's treacherous, decadent, power-crazed, frivolous. Her voice is shrill. She is phony, inauthentic, unlikable, unpresidential. She's a witch, a bitch. She's ugly, dresses poorly. Her clothes cost too much. Her butt is big. Her hair is wrong. She is angry, nasty, hormonally imbalanced, and irrational. If she has no children, she's selfish. If she does have children and has political ambitions, She's selfish. She is a bad woman, a bad wife, a bad mother. She is a sexy vixen whose wanton ways and feminine wiles destroy good men. She is the very essence of moral turpitude, demolishing everything she surveys as she strides through life in 4-inch stilettos, cackling wildly. There is, I discovered, a clear pattern of vilification across the millennia and throughout history to bring down powerful individuals suffering from chronic no penis syndrome. It's as if for thousands of years, somebody has been passing along an instruction manual, and I call it the misogynist's handbook. The handbook was crafted to enforce the patriarchy. Though no one knows for sure, it is likely that the patriarchy arose in the shrouded mists of unrecorded human history. Its enforcement arm, that I call the handbook, probably did too, and is therefore one of those rare books written long before writing was invented. And for many thousands of years, the handbook has kept women in line, and it still does so today. And even today, we give appalling men a pass with boys will be boys and it's only locker room talk, while we demonize, belittle, shame, ridicule, vilify, slander, and silence women. And what I discovered in my deep dive into misogyny, past and present, is that a combination of lies, hatred, and sexism, often initially brooded about by one or two political enemies, have been repeated so often over the centuries that they have become inseparable from historical fact and are usually accepted without question. And today, the proliferation of sexist lies is much worse than it was long ago, because all you need to do is push a button on social media and the lie flies around the world, potentially reaching millions in moments. So these are some of the chapters in the Misogynist Handbook, and in my book, Off With Her Head, each one of my chapters looks at one of these. And there are actually many more. I'm hoping that after this talk, and especially if you read my book, your eyes will be open to how common misogyny is in our everyday life. The triumph of misogyny is its invisibility. So if the woman doesn't go back to her place, off with her head, it's high time that we re-examine history's most loathsome villainesses, the murderous harlot queens, as well as modern female leaders who have been painted in slime with the same ancient sexist brush. Now, in most cases, we will find that with the tiniest bit of investigation, the towering souffle of vilification falls flat. There is no there. The notorious legacies of most powerful women, both ancient and modern, are simply not deserved. Now, all of us, including us women, inhale misogyny from our first breath. It is so normal we often don't see it. Even I am sometimes blind to my own misogyny. Bear in mind that I locked myself in a room for 2 years to research and write this book. And recently, my husband came home and said that he had just seen a brand new doctor. And I asked, what did he say? And my husband said, honey, my new doctor is a she. And I was like, oh, how could I even have done this? So with all of this misogyny coding everything, it can be really hard to pinpoint what is sexist and what is fair criticism. What if a woman is just a really lousy politician and it has nothing to do with her gender? So one way I found clarity was to change the genders in a particular situation and just see if a statement sounds weird. The statements I'm going to read you were said in recent elections about female candidates, and I have switched the gender in these statements to male. So please tell me if they sound ridiculous to you. Okay. Men who are sweet, cheery, and non-confrontational will be rewarded. He should show a little modesty. He's too bitchy. Humility is not one of his strong points. Unbelievable. In the same week, he wore the same suit twice. He doesn't have the right sort of body to be on TV. He should smile a lot more. And there are dozens more, but let's end with my personal favorite. He launched his political career in the bedroom by sleeping with a powerful woman. So don't they sound silly? But if you switch the gender back to male, they would sound normal, right? So let's look at the earliest recorded examples of misogyny. In an astonishing coincidence, the creation myths of both the Bible and ancient Greece, arguably the twin pillars of Western culture, attribute all the world's ills, death, war, plague, tsunamis, dandruff, flat tires, acne, everything, to the woman. It's all her fault. In the biblical book of Genesis, God tells Adam not to eat a particular fruit before he created Eve. And we can assume that either God or Adam told Eve. And Eve, listening to the serpent, which is, by the way, a Bronze Age symbol of feminine power and wisdom, tells Adam, hey, let's eat the fruit. And Adam does. And God tosses them both out of paradise and posts a terrifying angel waving a flaming sword at the entrance so they could never get back in. And so all of humanity was consigned to toil, pain, and suffering for eternity because of a woman's disobedience. Now, of course, Adam could have said, oh no, Eve, I will not eat the apple that God forbade us to eat, and neither should you. But alas, the naive, harmless fellow couldn't resist her, what with her seductive, manipulative ways. So since thousands of years of history have judged all women by the badly behaved Eve, we might also deduce that all men are bumbling idiots, too stupid to question a terrible idea. But somehow that part got lost in translation. In the Greek myth of Pandora, Zeus created her, the first woman, as a curse upon mankind and handed her a box filled with all the evils of the world, telling her not to open it and knowing that she probably would. A man named Epimetheus, though he had been warned to steer clear of Pandora, took one look at her beauty and married her. Whereupon she disobeyed Zeus, very much as Eve had disobeyed God, and opened the box, releasing death, war, illness, and everything else horrible. So the parallels between the Pandora story and the Eve story are quite eye-opening, because in the Greek myth too, the first woman's disobedience caused all the pain and misery ever since. And again, no one has ever shifted any blame onto the dim-witted Epimetheus, who ignored the god Zeus's warning and let his lust rule the day. He and Adam both get a boys will be boys pass for their nitwittedness. How strange it is that both God with a capital G and God with a little g brought evil into the world by creating woman, according to the stories written by men. So it's logical to assume that misogyny was around a good long while before the earliest woman-hating stories were set down in the Hebrew Bible and the Greek myths, and the origins must be rooted in biology. Women were the only ones who nourished life in their bodies and brought it forth, just as the earth brings forth grains, vegetables, and fruits. And indeed, the reason women worked with crops may not have been solely due to their physical limitations in hunting mammoths, but because they could conjure life from the earth, just as they conjured it from their own magical bodies during the miracle of childbirth. And the unceasing rhythm of women's bodies was magically synced up with the moon itself. So it's possible that men suffered horribly from uterus envy. And moreover, being so powerful, threatened to throw an orderly society into wild discord if they were not properly contained. What would women do if they fully unleashed their powers? Create whirlwinds, droughts, and floods, ride cackling on lightning bolts, release demons from the underworld. It's really no mystery why, until 1979, in the US, all hurricanes were given female names. Women's terrifying destructive power must therefore be curbed, caged, constricted, diminished, kept in place. Otherwise, she eats the apple, she opens the box, she unleashes her fury on the Gulf of Mexico. All hell breaks loose and we are doomed. Now, let's turn to examine the way misogyny has shaped the stories of powerful women that have come down to us throughout the ages, as a matter of fact. And we'll begin with the biblical Jezebel, whose name has become a byword for slut. The only extant mention of her was written by her fiercest enemies in the biblical book of Kings. Jezebel was a foreign princess who married King Ahab of Israel and brought her own gods with her to her new home, as was the tradition of the time. Her husband allowed her to build temples to them and appoint priests, which upset the local worshippers of the Hebrew god Yahweh. Now, Jezebel was a fiercely strong and independent woman, according to Kings, which made sexist men even angrier, as it still does today. When her husband died, her grown son Joram became king, and Yahweh's prophet Elisha consecrated Jehu, a follower of Yahweh, in Joram's place and convinced him to kill the king, which he did. So, hearing the news of her son's murder and knowing Jehu was on his way to the palace to kill her, Jezebel sat down at her dressing table, applied kohl to her eyes, arranged her hair, and bedecked herself as befitting a queen. Then she sat in her window to watch Jehu drive up in his chariot. Now, readers throughout the centuries have assumed that Jezebel, who was now a dignified widow and grandmother, probably in her 50s or 60s, was trying to seduce a much younger man who had just treacherously murdered her son, which is not very likely. And many biblical scholars see her actions as insisting that she meet her death on her own terms, imbued with royal grandeur, so that Jehu understood exactly that he was killing a queen. And rather than showing her charms at the window, hoping to vanquish him through lust, she sat there calmly awaiting her murderer, looking down at him scornfully as he clattered up. She gave him a mocking, insulting greeting, comparing him to another man who had treacherously murdered his king. And at a sign from Jehu, her eunuchs threw her from the window, where the horses and chariots trod on her, and only a few pieces of her were left after the dogs got her. And the carcass of Jezebel shall be as dung upon the face of the field in the portion of Jezreel, the chapter ends, so that they shall not say, this is Jezebel. In other words, the trollop had it coming. Now, bear in mind that Elisha, who is considered a holy man with powers directly from God, commanded in the same chapter a bear to devour 42 children who had laughed at his baldness, evidently a sore point for Elisha. This is not something they tell you in church, incidentally. So Elisha also killed hundreds of men, women, and children who had prayed to Jezebel's gods once Jehu took over. But Jezebel is the one we remember for her crimes. No one is exactly sure when Mary Magdalene became a prostitute, but it was probably some 500 years after her death. In a church actively entrenching itself in misogyny, this powerful figure in Jesus's ministry needed to be diminished and silenced. In the 4 canonical Gospels, Mary Magdalene traveled with Jesus and his disciples, along with other women who, according to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus had cured of evil spirits and diseases. According to Mark and Luke, Jesus had driven out 7 demons from Mary Magdalene, which in the first century may have meant an illness that required 7 exorcisms for complete healing. She and the other women traveled with Jesus and the disciples, helping to support them out of their own means, according to Luke. And clearly she was a woman of some wealth. Mary Magdalene is mentioned 12 times in the Gospels, more than most of the disciples, and all 4 Gospels state that she was present at the crucifixion and was the first, either alone or with other women, to find Jesus's empty tomb. Moreover, in Matthew, Mark, and John, she was the first person to see the resurrected Jesus. According to John, as she stood outside the tomb, Jesus appeared and instructed her to relay to the disciples a crucial message. I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. In extra-canonical texts, she is referred to as one of Jesus's closest companions, and it is possible that she was an early Christian leader. An early 3rd century church father, Hippolytus, called her apostle to the apostles. So the best way to destroy the memory of a powerful woman is to turn her into a whore. And in a series of sermons in 591 AD, Pope Gregory I conflated Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman in Luke 7 who anointed Jesus's feet with perfume and tears and dried them with her hair. Though the exact nature of that woman's sins were never revealed, many assumed she was either a repentant prostitute or at least enjoyed the company of men a bit too much. But, maybe her sins had nothing to do with sex. Maybe she cheated at cards or shoplifted in the Forum. Suddenly, this repentant woman and Mary Magdalene were one and the same, and Jesus's beloved companion had been pornified and delegitimized for all time. Cleopatra, as we all know, used her dangerous allure to unman poor Mark Antony, the beefy Roman general, who lay supine on a purple couch as she dropped grapes into his mouth, when he should have been conquering new territory for Rome. The fact is that Cleopatra was a popular ruler who effectively managed a booming economy and complex international relations. The Egyptian people considered her to be nothing less than a goddess incarnate. Her main concern was staving off annexation by the greedy, warlike Romans, the conquerors of many other lands, who for some time had been eyeing the Nile breadbasket to feed their armies. Though Romans quite effectively slut-shamed her, putting it about that she had sex with thousands of men, we know of only two lovers, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the latter whom she married. But the leaders of the Roman Republic had to take her down, a woman who dared rule a nation, and quite effectively, and challenge the patriarchy of Rome. But instead of blaming Mark Antony, who was one of them, a man from a distinguished Roman family and a general, for behavior which clearly flew in the face of Roman expectations, they blamed the foreign woman. She made him do it using her seductive feminine wiles. They also called her a murderer and a poisoner and possessed of unseemly ambition and impertinence. Bear in mind, Cleopatra was the pharaoh. How could she be impertinent? How could she be overly ambitious? They didn't mention that Mark Antony was a drunken, womanizing fool with the unseemly ambition of becoming emperor of the East. And because it was the Romans who wrote her history, it is their version of events that have come down to us about Cleopatra. Conjure up an image of Anne Boleyn, and you will likely envision a cruel, cunning woman of overweening ambition, using the promise of tantric sex to rip apart a royal marriage and trash the national religion to make herself Queen of England. It's a compellingly misogynistic story, a bitchy vixen against a pious middle-aged wife, the king a hapless victim of his own lust and the little tramp's manipulation. And the ending, the villainess losing her head on the scaffold, is a satisfying morality tale. Just look at what happens to women like that. Even if she didn't commit the crime she was executed for, adultery with 5 men, one of them her own brother, she certainly had it coming. So what most of us had heard about her life comes from 2 sources, both of whom despised her. One was Spain's ambassador to England, Eustace Chapuis, who was devoted to Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, writing to his royal master every bit of unflattering gossip on Anne he could dig up at the English court. He called Anne that whore and the concubine, and obsessively wrote the most outrageous rumors that somebody had heard that somebody else had heard. In a book published some 50 years after Anne's death, in the reign of her Protestant daughter Elizabeth I, whom he loathed, the second source, Catholic propagandist Nicholas Sander, portrayed Anne as a heartless whore with all the markings of a witch, who bore a monstrous deformed fetus, a sure sign of involvement with Satan, and slept with pretty much anybody and everybody. Other contemporary sources, however, provide a different portrait of Anne, one that refutes the image of her as a selfish, wanton temptress. For instance, when the king was first stalking her, because that's what it was, she fled to her home in the country and stayed away from him for a year. One source claimed that Anne fled the king for, and I quote, the love she bare to the queen whom she served. It seems Anne cared about the woman she had spent so many years serving as lady in waiting and was embarrassed that the king was pursuing her. Only when he told her he would get his marriage to Catherine annulled and marry Anne, did she agree to become his wife. And as queen, she gave copious portions of her income to the poor and to poor scholars. She was a champion of religious reform and instructed her court to be pious and God-fearing. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis wrote that when news arrived at court that Catherine of Aragon had died, Henry VIII donned a yellow outfit and danced in celebration. Anne, however, locked herself in her room and cried. And this came from Anne's fiercest enemy. And yet, if you watch movies and TV shows about this event, they all show Anne Boleyn wearing a yellow dress and dancing. The reports of her decorous behavior, zeal for religious reform, and charity to the poor aren't nearly as engaging as those of a middle-aged queen and her ambitious lady-in-waiting mud wrestling over the affections of the king. Now, the clues that show Anne had another side have been there all along. They've been mentioned in books about her, but never focused on, as they prove inconvenient to the misogynistic story of slutty villainous. We accept the most negative spin on Anne, written by her worst enemies, and come up with the story that she wrapped Henry VIII, that compliant, easily manipulated fellow, around her witchy sixth finger. The truth is that Henry VIII was a ruthless sociopath who never did a thing he didn't want to do. And after he killed Anne, he continued to behave appallingly to his wives and daughters. Catherine de' Medici, the powerful queen mother of France, has come down to us as a witch-like creature, swathed in black, a mass murderer, a poisoner, and a vicious, ambitious, manipulative woman. Her reputation was built upon misogyny and xenophobia. She was a foreign woman who became quite powerful after her husband, King Henry II, died in a jousting accident when she was 40. But her reputation was mostly trashed by a book that came out in 1575 during her lifetime, that shredded her reputation forever and carved in stone the legend of the sinister queen, which we still have today. The book was written by an anonymous Huguenot who survived the 1572 St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in which government forces killed dozens of carefully targeted, powerful Huguenots. And seeing the murders, Catholic citizens started killing every Huguenot they could get their hands on, and this thing spread like wildfire. Thousands of Huguenots ended up murdered, and this one anonymous writer blamed the whole thing on Catherine. Now, bear in mind, many surviving Huguenots made their way to Switzerland after the massacre, which welcomed Protestants of any stripe. And many of them published books blaming the king, Catherine's mentally unstable son, or his ambitious brother, or a chief minister. But the one book that blamed Catherine as a witchy, manipulative murderess was the bestseller and shaped our understanding of the event. Now, for more than 4 centuries, the story of the murderous Catherine became so stuck in popular culture that few have ever questioned it. But anybody who takes the time to research her life will see that she spent a decade before the massacre trying to end the religious civil war destroying France. She negotiated, cajoled, bribed, flattered, reconciled, accommodated, and temporized, doing everything possible to avoid bloodshed and keep the peace. It is extremely unlikely she would suddenly say, "Ah, to hell with it, let's just kill them all." And then after the massacre, spend the remaining 17 years of her life once more laboring ceaselessly for peace, bouncing all over France for years on a donkey, often in great physical pain. If Catherine were alive today, spending the same energy on stopping hostilities, she would most likely be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize rather than being seen as a mass murderer. Marie Antoinette was quite literally an off-with-her-head victim. She was married to Louis XVI, a weak king caught in the lethal mix of economic disaster and political change spiced by climate cataclysm. She was expected to wear elaborate clothing befitting the dignity of a queen of France, coiffures sometimes 3 feet high, her hair teased over wooden frames, topped by feathers, ribbons, strands of pearls, and even miniature ships. Her sumptuous wardrobe included hundreds of gowns of silk and satin and jewels the size of hen's eggs. Many of her skirts were so wide it looked as if she had a buffet table under all those yards of shimmering, beribboned silk. But democracy was in the air, and the queen was harshly criticized for wasting taxpayer money on her clothes. This is an echo we still have this day and age. Remember Sarah Palin a few years ago. When Marie had her portrait painted in a simple cotton dress with a ruffled collar, she was harshly criticized for lacking in royal dignity. This is one thing modern women also find. You can't win no matter what you do and what you wear. So she became the most hated high-profile woman until Hillary Clinton. She was the subject of pornographic writings for many years before the 1789 fall of the Bastille. Anti-monarchy pamphlets portrayed the queen as pathologically horny. Their titles included The Royal Dildo, The Uterine Furors of Marie Antoinette, and The Patriotic Bordello, some of them lovingly illustrated and hand-colored. In addition to drought, famine, mismanagement of the royal coffers, these were all blamed on her, a woman with no political power of her own whatsoever, rather than her good-hearted but rather daft husband, Louis XVI, who had the power. But this continues our theme of blaming the woman, right, and giving the men a pass. Perhaps the most egregious case of male horror at a successful female rule was that of Catherine the Great of Russia. Over the course of her 35-year reign, Catherine expanded her borders by 200,000 square miles and promoted the arts, literature, and education, creating the Russian Golden Age. But ask anyone today one thing they've heard about Catherine the Great, and they will probably say that she died while trying to have sex with a horse, which never happened. The Empress died of a stroke in 1796 at the age of 67, but her astonishing success proved misogynistic assumptions wrong, and something had to be done to ruin her reputation forever. Hillary Clinton has been harshly criticized for her voice, her laugh, her ankles, just about every hairstyle and outfit she has ever worn. She has been accused of operating a pedophilia ring under a pizza parlor in Washington, in the basement, where she molested and cannibalized children. That particular pizza parlor, by the way, does not have a basement. She has been accused of dozens of murders, just about anyone she ever knew who did not die of cancer in a hospital. Though oddly, she never murdered the biggest threats to her political ambitions, namely Monica Lewinsky and Donald Trump. Somehow those two are still walking around. Perhaps it's not surprising that in 2016, bumper stickers appeared in the US advertising the Hillary meal deal: 2 fat thighs, 2 small breasts, and a bunch of left wings. Despite the political rancor of the Trump years, we never saw anyone chopping him up and slapping him on a menu. Donald Duck à l'orange, stuffed with lard with a fat rump and tiny testicles. They just don't generally do this kind of thing to men. And indeed, when we question whether something is sexist or not, again, we just need to see if the same kinds of things are being done to men as are being done to women. Julia Gillard was the first female prime minister of Australia from 2010 to 2013, and she too has been criticized for her voice, her decision not to have children, her political ambitions, just about everything she ever wore, the size of her rear end, the size of her earlobes, the size of her breasts, and the size of her thighs. She has been called a bitch, a witch, and a barren cow ripe for the slaughterhouse. When she posed for photographers in her bare kitchen beside an empty fruit bowl pictured here, she dislikes clutter and had just returned home from an international trip. According to the press, the empty fruit bowl symbolized an empty wound, a womb, an empty life, and an icy, selfish heart. A newspaper, The Australian, reported she has showcased a bare home and an empty kitchen as badges of honor and commitment to her career. She has never had to make room for the frustrating demands and magnificent responsibilities of caring for little babies, picking up sick children from school, and raising teenagers. It never occurred to me, Gillard wrote, that anyone could really contend that my life, my thoughts, my character, and my worth could be defined by the state of my kitchen. No fruit. I think that was the principal flaw. No fruit. I now always have rotting bananas in the bowl just in case. Now, it's hard to imagine such hows of moral outrage if a man had allowed himself to be photographed in a bare kitchen next to an empty fruit bowl. When Joe Biden was looking for a female woman of color to be his VP pick, Kamala Harris, a top candidate, was widely criticized in the mainstream media and by other politicians, even Biden allies, as being too ambitious. And being ambitious, she would want to become president herself. Something oddly enough, she was not supposed to want. That, in other words, the former vice president running for president shouldn't have a vice president who wanted to become president. Wrap your mind around that. So 14 vice presidents have gone on to become president, and Biden would become the 15th. So it's strange to suggest that Biden choose as his running mate someone who had no aspirations in that direction. Though come to think of it, some other vice presidents were shy, self-effacing characters with no presidential ambitions of their own. Just look at Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon, the very definition of blushing, bashful fellows who positively wilted under any attention. Now, compare this to when Mitt Romney chose Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan as his running mate in 2008. Romney's supporters didn't jump all over Ryan for his political ambitions. On the contrary, the media lauded Ryan as a young, ambitious Beltway insider with camera-ready presence. No one suggested that Paul Ryan should be more loyal, modest, and deferential, remorseful for anything he ever said that might have sounded critical of his running mate during the primaries. So racism as we know it has been around for about 500 years as justification for enslaving human beings. And think how we are still struggling with that injustice. So how much more difficult than that will it be to stamp out sexism, which, as far as I can tell, started in the dawn of human history tens of thousands of years ago? So after thousands of years of beheading, skewering, silencing and shaming politically powerful women, is misogyny ever really going to go away? What can we do here and now with all the tools that we have at hand to put an end to such a dominant mindset adversely affecting half the population? How do we purge ourselves of the powerful paleo-misogyny clinging to us through hundreds of generations like an everlasting curse? So one recent measure involved women's organizations putting out media guidelines on how to avoid sexist tropes when reporting on female candidates. Reporting in an Era of Disinformation, Fairness Guide for Covering Women and People of Color in Politics. It points out that a candidate must be evaluated on her experience, her past decisions, and her ability to step into the top job. The guide then asks reporters and commentators, are you punishing women and celebrating men for doing the same thing? Are you suggesting ambition is a bad thing? Are you putting too much emphasis on appearance? Are you focusing on her tone of voice, shrill, bitter, angry, rather than the substance of her statements? Are you telling a candidate to smile? It's only women who get told that. Are you hypersexualizing a candidate or politician? Are you commenting on her attractiveness or lack thereof? Are you using words like unlikable or unelectable? They're almost always only used for women. Are you questioning her commitment to the United States based on the color of her skin or country of origin? Are you calling a Black woman angry? So another thing that we need to do is get more women elected to stop this kind of thing. So many of them, in fact, that they are no longer oddities. Amanda Hunter of the women's political organization, the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, told me that the imagination barrier hurts women candidates. The fact that many voters have difficulty picturing women in power, which is an area dominated by white men. She said, seeing more women in office, seeing a woman vice president chips away at the imagination barrier and takes down stereotypes. Women governors often open the door to other women governors. We will change the conversation by having more women run for and get elected to office. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Eleanor, thank you very much for your informative, eye-opening presentation. At this point, we will be answering some questions that have come in ahead of our scheduled meeting today, and also those who have been submitted through the chat space. You can continue to send those questions in. And I'm going to let Barbara Marshman, a league member and former editorial page editor of the Mercury News, take over this section of our meeting. Barbara, take it away. It's all yours.
Thank you. Wow, what a so many things that I never thought about before. And I have read some of your work, but it really was a marvelous summary.
Thank you.
There you are. Sorry, my Zoom wasn't working right. So historically and globally, there have certainly been some cultures, and maybe today that I think there are today that show more respect or actually have somewhat of an egalitarian society. Have you looked at those and drawn any conclusions?
There always has been a range of freedoms and equality. If any of you know anything about ancient Greece, the two major states were Athens and Sparta. And Athens, if you were a woman of good family, you were pretty much locked up in a harem. You had the women's quarters, and I'm just reading some of these. These are great little messages coming through. I'll try not to look at them at the moment. So they had no rights. They couldn't inherit. The servants would get food. They couldn't even leave the house. So they were pretty much prisoners, as many women are today in the Middle East. Whereas their enemy Sparta, which was the culture of the warrior, they encouraged women to go out for long distance runs and lift weights and be really outside in the fresh air and involved. Why? Because they wanted them to give birth to healthy, strong warriors. And they realized that only healthy, strong women would be in a position to do that. Now, fast forward 2,500 years, I looked up the Gender Inequality Index, where the United States is number 46 in the world behind Belarus and Kazakhstan. And the things that are considered in this index is, access to education, to career opportunities. Is a compensation the same or close for women and men? What about healthcare and childcare and all of that? And we're number 46. So we clearly have a long way to go. We have come a long way. But we are allowed to drive and to vote and to run for public office, and so we are ahead of many people, many countries in the world.
Okay, but there is no there's no type of culture, no civilization that you can think of that has really set an example here that we could be more.
Some of them are better than others. For some reason, the Scandinavian countries and Iceland, Switzerland is number one on the index. So, but eradicating at 100%, I don't think we'll see that in our lifetime.
No. Oh, no. After all these thousands of years. Lots of interesting questions coming through. Do you have any practical suggestions for women who are in the situation of being demonized, even Anglo women, for being both a woman and a person of color? Does your work expand into how to do something about it?
Right, and the fact that we're even asking the question is just so unfair, because
right.
Nobody would ask that of a man, right?
Exactly.
But so let's look at this question, and it is a difficult balancing act. What women have to do in those situations is show firmness without anger. Mm-hmm. Anger is emotion, and we already have the trope of the hormonally imbalanced white woman or the angry Black woman. So you don't want to go there. By the same token, if you're just sweet and smiling and let the man, I don't know, squeeze your knee, talk over you, you're going to be seen as weak and ineffective, and certainly not in a position to be a leader. So I think a good example of that would be, if you remember the vice presidential debate 3 years ago, when Mike Pence just kept rolling over Kamala Harris. You know, she had her 2 minutes to answer a question. She didn't roll over him. So he just kept interrupting her. And so she said, you know, without anger, but with great firmness, Mr. Vice President, I am talking. So it's something like that, you know, and this balancing act that we women have to do is like being on a tightrope over the Grand Canyon, juggling 15 balls with a full tea service on our heads. You know, we can do it, but it's really, really hard. And ultimately, it's just so unfair that we have to do it.
It appears, several people have mentioned, it appears that there is a broad media conspiracy, which, yeah, I'm not a conspiracy person, but I have to admit that the coverage of Kamala Harris, except for complete, you know, fairly objective descriptions of what she's doing here and there, seems to be negative. Do you think there is anything that can be done to counter that? Not to say whether Kamala Harris would be a wonderful president or not.
Right.
I'm
Yeah, we're not talking policy or platform,
but we're not, you know, we're not talking policy. What can you do when there is this sense of unfairness out
you know,
there?
she's in a very difficult situation. First of all, she's a woman. Secondly, she's a woman of color.
Right.
And thirdly, the job of vice president of the United States is probably one of the worst and most poorly defined in any political system ever. I mean, there are really no responsibilities other than from time to time presiding over the Senate, and you know, the president will give her things that he, you know, wants her to do. But I mean, you know, I was excited when she became vice president as a woman, and I haven't really heard that much about what she's been doing. I think the problem is there's so much chaos. I mean, just turn on your news. It's the indictments about Donald Trump. It's the investigations into the Biden family earnings. It's all of, you know, where is room for poor Kamala Harris and her trade mission to Taiwan to see, you know, so my impression is that other people's impression is that she's just sort of ineffective and not really doing a very good job, but we're not really seeing her. And based on all of that woman's accomplishments before she took the job, I can't believe she's ineffective. I think she's probably very efficient and very effective, and we're not hearing about it.
Yeah. A listener brought up Jane Addams, social reformer, first American female Nobel Peace Prize recipient, which I did not know. Have you looked at her at all in your research?
Not in my book. I focused on women with political power, or who were in a royal family. So I didn't get into the activists.
Okay. Folks believe that mental health diagnoses and treatments have been used to demonize women over time. Have you looked at that aspect of the problem?
I have a whole chapter on, you know, she's emotionally imbalanced. She's hormonally unhinged.
Right.
So yes, that has always, I mean, there are quotations from, you know, ancient Rome and Greece that women can't be, you know, trusted with power because that time of the month, or if, you know, they're during menopause, their decisions are not going to be rational. And, you know, in recent years in this country, there have been statements made that, you know, a woman president, because of her hormonal imbalances, might start an unnecessary war, like the war in Vietnam or the war in Iraq,
Right.
which were not started by women, right? So it's just very ironic.
Yeah. Um, do you deal much with, this will sound, with men? Do you make these presentations to male organizations?
I haven't to male organizations. I was at the History Book Festival last fall doing it was a huge room. It was like standing room only. My husband was there, and there was this really nice gentleman in the front row. And after I finished speaking, he got up and he said, "Do you hate me?" Hate you? Why?
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel sorry for men. I mean, it's this is a real problem. We're all in this together, and we need to have compassion for ourselves and for everyone else. We are born into a system that's been there for thousands of years. We grow up thinking it's normal, and then pushing against those boundaries, there's often pushback and criticism, and people freak out because it's changed and we don't like the system anymore. And so I think we just all need to to try a bit of compassion with ourselves, and just applaud men who are on our side, who do want equality for us, and I think most of them do. I mean, they have mothers and sisters and daughters and wives, and it's just true that we always hear about the worst people. They're the ones that make the news, and I think most people are very decent, and we can move forward together trying to diminish the sexism in our society.
Yeah. Mexico is an interesting case in point to me. A good friend of mine is very involved in observing elections down there, and in Anne Ravel, by the way, for folks who may know Anne. She's been prominent in state and national circles. Mexico has laws that are, and you're nodding, you may know this, that are very egalitarian. Mexico requires that its houses of Congress be 50% women. Women's rights and voting, and it seems like the legal structure there is way better than ours. But I'm not sure the culture prevalent in much of Mexico, or I mean, is that different? Have you ever looked at that? It's an interesting dichotomy to me, that a nation that has a reputation of being misogynistic is, in its legal system, just amazingly egalitarian.
I don't know the history of how that started. I imagine there were some people who showed great leadership and pushed it through, and it could be because of the general tendency towards misogyny in the culture, that maybe the women rose up and helped create this new system. I was doing some research recently and saw that the country in the world with the greatest percentage of women in the Senate or the Parliament, the top political body, you might never guess this, Rwanda. And I imagine it's because, given the horrendous massacres there in the 1990s, that there was a backlash against male rule. I mean, because men are much more tempted to go to war than women. I've researched studies that show when there are peace negotiations, if even a single woman is at the table reminding people of the future of their children, that you can't burn the crops because then your kids won't have anything to eat, this kind of thing. If there is one woman at the table, any negotiation that's made is 5 times more likely to end hostilities in the long term. So, women, I'm not saying that men shouldn't be at the table, because they have a different kind of energy that is also valuable. But I think the best situation is to have a blend of men and women, to make peace treaties, to run a government. And I think we're not quite there yet in terms of the equality of the numbers.
Do you think an equal rights amendment can ever pass in the United States?
You know, I think that boat may have left the dock. I mean, I think the time was, what was it, 30 years ago? When was it? It was a big push.
Yep.
I mean, it's hard to believe that we don't have one. It's probably what we're number 46 on the equality index, right? But then a lot of people think we don't need one because look, even when my book first came out a year ago, some people were sort of pushing back, like, you get to vote and you can drive your car, and I'm like, well, okay, yeah, but that's really not that's not all that I want to do. Like, we can go much further with equality.
Right. It's fascinating. What advice do you have for young women starting out? It's, I mean, touch of perspective. It's my perception, being, a dinosaur, that young women today are not as perhaps politically active, not as conscious of things like the right to choice and abortion, and I think it and there are other examples, but it seems as though the younger generation is not as engaged in fighting for rights as, say, some of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s. Do you perceive that? And is there any way, if it is a serious concern, is there any way to counter it?
Yeah, I think the younger generation will surprise us. They have seen a Black female vice president. They're growing up in different times. I think especially young women are not going to put up with the sexism that we did when I first started working in the 1980s. There were ashtrays on the table. So I think back, it's like Mad Men, right?
Yeah.
And people were drinking martinis at lunch. And the sexist comments and the men squeezing my elbow, and that just will not be tolerated anymore. I think it was Gloria Steinem who said, these days you call it sexism, back then we called it life, right? So I think there is a new awareness. I think the Me Too movement did a great deal for that. And I just think these young women are not going to tolerate. I mean, you and I thought this was normal, and we had to sort of smile and gently remove the hand from our knee because we didn't want to get fired or lose our big client or, make waves. And in this day and age, it's like, hell no, get your damn hand off me. I'm going to report you, right? And I think that this is a different time. And, maybe they don't go burning their bras. Each generation is different. And I hope I'm around long enough to see what the people in their teens and 20s now come up with.
Me too. How are we doing for time, Martha? Are we?
We're probably at time.
Okay.
Yeah. Excuse me, Barbara. We have two people in the audience who have their hands raised. Would you like to take their questions?
Absolutely.
Okay. The first one is Jenny Baird. Click on
her.
I did. I enabled her to talk.
Okay, good. Jenny, what is your question? I am not hearing you.
Yeah, unmute yourself.
Pardon?
Here she comes.
Okay.
Jenna? I'm sorry, we just can't hear you.
Maybe she could write it in the chat.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay, let's take the question from Ann Clark.
Okay. And let's see, has to unmute. There we go.
I did put this in the chat, and it's perhaps more trivial. As you were talking about politicians who, being told to smile and all that, seems to me that Ron DeSantis is kind of breaking a mold there in a negative way, because everyone talks about his awful voice and that he doesn't smile and that he has a terrible personality. I mean, I don't like him either, but that's for policy reasons. And yes, he breaks the mold.
I've never seen that before. Come to think of it, right? Like the stuff they do about him, it's textbook misogyny.
Exactly.
Right? Except I haven't heard them criticize like he wears the same suit too often, or
It's all been
his
in place.
ankles are fat, or I mean, there are a few things they haven't done yet, but they criticize the voice, the face. Yeah, you're right. That is really funny. That is an exception to the rule. I love that.
That's interesting. Janu, are we?
No, she says she doesn't have a
Oh,
doesn't have a question. It was a mistake.
I see. Okay.
Okay, Avra Rossman.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Yes. Have you studied anything about how women are treated and demonized in the mental health industry? Women who have been locked up for women with emotional problems who have been locked up against their will for mental illness.
No.
And
Yeah, I have not studied that. I was just looking at, you know, women running for public office, or women who were in royal families and had some influence on political power.
okay. If you know of any leads for me of how women have been demonized and treated unfairly in the mental health industry, please let me know.
Okay.
And I also asked, how do I save the chat? I wasn't able to get the 3 dots. Or can someone send me the chat?
Maybe Carol know anything about that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, is there a way to save the chat? I'm not getting the 3 dots. Or can someone send me the chat?
We'll save the chat.
There's one other question here I'd like to answer, if I may. It's from Judy Kleinberg. What about women as the demonizers? What do we do about women who do not like or are turned off by strong, assertive women? And my book gets into that a lot. There have been studies done where, you know, vicious sexist comments about, say, a photograph on Instagram or something of another woman, they're 55% made by women. And so the question is, are women, are some of them, do they feel threatened by, are they jealous of women who run for public office, or who are thinner, younger, more I don't know, but I think we all need to just take a deep breath and a step back and just, you know, just ask ourselves what we're doing. And I'm guilty of this as well. I watch the nightly news, and someone will come in, and the first thing I say to my husband is, why doesn't she pluck her eyebrows? And then I'm like, why do I care? Why am I saying that? You know, I've just been so conditioned in a certain way of thinking. And we can't help our first reaction. That's there. We can help our second one. That's where we have choice. Like, Eleanor, why did you say that? Why do you care about? Would you say that about a man's eyebrows? Well, maybe if they're out to here, but like if they're just a little shaggy, probably not. Right. So I think I would just like all of us to start analyzing our own thoughts and reactions. And sometimes our initial reactions are very unkind. And we undo them with our second reaction.
Beverly DeShow had an interesting note in the chat that I missed when we were talking about DeSantis and clothes. She said the exception about clothes is a Black president wearing a tan suit.
Please, yes.
And someone else mentioned that Ronald Reagan used to wear tan suits. So I guess it's perhaps doesn't explain DeSantis, but it can be a racial thing. Anyone else have questions? Yeah. No, there are a lot of
Comments.
Yeah. Someone mentions Margaret Truman wrote a book about many of these exceptional women in history. Might be fun to. I think I will look that up. You got lots of implicit bias. Yeah, people can be. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and we'll be happy to.
Wait, someone said, how do we book Eleanor?
How do we book? What are you referring to?
I don't know. It's from Ruth to host and panelists. Maybe she wants me to speak. For a talk.
Oh, how do we book you? How do we get you to speak to another organization?
Right. Maybe, do you know Ruth? Maybe you can. Yeah. Wait, maybe I can contact her. So Ruth Jusan, is that it? Yeah.
Mhm.
Ruth. Okay, I'm going to give you my email. Okay.
It's funny, in our context, I was thinking she was referring to Eleanor Roosevelt. No, you are the new Eleanor. Okay. Anything else? Oh, actually, Pierluigi Oliverio notes that Switzerland did not allow women to vote until 1971.
Crazy, right? And now they're #1 at the top of the equality index. They must have really made a lot of progress.
Perhaps pent-up determination.
Yes, yes.
Of course, it's a very small and very monolithic
It is
compared to us. No place is monolithic, I'm sure. Anything else? Martha, I'm happy to continue here, but I sometimes get called for going over. Let me know if we should keep going and just chat a while or not.
How about if for those who need to go and have other commitments, I just have a few things to highlight about the future of the league, and then you're free to answer questions with Eleanor as long as she's available, I believe. But I just wanted, first of all, to thank you, Barbara, for doing your part here and monitoring the questioning. And Eleanor, thank you again for being here with us today. And to everybody who chose to be a part of this conversation, you had great questions. Thank you for being here. We have 3 events that are coming up for the league. We ask that you put these on your calendar. The first is Wednesday, October 18. It will be a virtual candidates forum from 6 to 7:30 p.m. These will be candidates that are running for the San Jose Evergreen Community College District. You can sign up on our website and also get more information from votersedge.com. Next, on October 30th, which is a Monday, put a big X on your calendar. We're having an in-person event for current and future league members called League Connections. That will run from 5 to 7 p.m. There will be great food and drink. There'll be information about league activities and the opportunity for us to meet new people or just reconnect with longtime friends. Everyone is invited to this. Please tune in to the voter newsletter or check our website for updates on location and parking and all those important details. And lastly, on November 16th, Lunch with League returns with Santa Clara County Sheriff Bob Johnson. He will be our guest speaker that day. We'll convene at 12 noon as we did today. Thank you all for being with us today and carry on with the conversation.